Welcome to Policy Matters, Episode 7. Policy Matters is a video chat series between Teri Talon of the McCormick Center and a guest author in early childhood policy. The chats take place and are distributed on a quarterly basis. Our guest author for the next 4 episodes is author Stacie Goffin. Episode 7 is a continuation of Episode 6, where Stacie and Teri solidified the distinction between occupation and profession. In Episode 7, Stacie and Teri used the parallels they drew from other fields and Finland to address the question of how do we get from here to there.
So I don't want to ignore the second question that we had, and that was about, well, what would it look like to be able to get us to a place where we had well-prepared, well-qualified workforce of early childhood professionals who were ready to enter the classroom and were not in need of the additional education and continuing education. And I don't want to say that in need of continuing education, because I truly believe we all need continuing education as a professional, and that is part of all professions. But where we're not compensating and building the knowledge base while people are doing the job. So, the proverbial building the plane while flying it. So what would we need to do to be able to move that forward now that we know and we've come together to define competencies? How do we move that forward without major changes in policy?
I think we have to first agree that we want to do this as a field of practice, because we really do need to decide whether or not we are ready to take a stance that there is preparation that is required prior to the ability to enter into a early learning setting to actually practice with children. So that's a really big conversation that we have to engage in. And there are lots of multiple efforts now underway, probably among the most prominent being NAEYC's new initiative around power to the profession that I think is, as I understand it, is hoping to initiate these opportunities for these kinds of conversations. I think another element that's going to be very important once that is going to be then what is the chronological scope, defining who's in the profession and who's in the field. So I would define myself right now as being in the field of early childhood education. I would not see myself as being in a future profession of early childhood education because I am not directly engaged in practice. And that's a really important distinction. So I still get to claim, if you will, my pride, if you will, and commitment to the work that we do in early childhood education, but I would not be considered part of the profession, because the profession is about a field of practice and not necessarily all the other ways in which those of us are engaged are about ensuring that that practice can be at the highest caliber possible and that the circumstances are available so that those practices can in fact be executed and are supported as necessary by policy. And so higher ed is going to be absolutely crucial and moving forward, because one of the things that comes about also in a profession is once those competencies are defined, professions don't necessarily accredit early childhood education programs, for example, because they're focused on the individual. So their accreditations are really centered on the preparation program, because that's where the consistency in knowledge and skills comes from. So I could go to law school, I'm not sure where you went, but I could go to a different law school and I could be counted on to get the same knowledge that's going to be required to sit for a bar. When I sit for the bar, it's going to vary not because of the competencies that transcend the state's legal parameters. When I study for the bar, as much as anything, I'm studying about how does the state implement a particular law or rule differently than another state because of its own context. But what it takes to be an attorney doesn't matter which law school I go to, and the same for medical school. And then, yes, it will be about the amazing politics that are going to be involved to be recognized state by state by state. So physical therapy has now changed its entry requirements. It used to be a master's, it's now a doctorate for entry into the field. Nursing, you actually have two, there are actually three pathways, but the two that are still most viable are the 2-year and the 4-year to be able to sit for the RN licensure. They have, after many years of debate and conversation, have now decided that entry to sit for the licensure has to have a minimum of the bachelor's, the BSN. They're now going state by state to change what's going on at the state level in terms of having that profession-driven recommendation accepted by the state and recognized as such.
So it sounds to me like you've laid out a pathway for how to get from there to where we want to be, because we could build on the knowledge that we have from these other professions that have done exactly what we are talking about doing with early childhood education. In terms of, it sounds like some of the components is this a national or I guess a profession-wide understanding of the core knowledge that all professionals would be held to, a perhaps state-based licensure model that would take into context the local situation, but build on these broad competencies that are in place regardless of where you're located. So thinking about the recommendations that Lynn Kagan had at the end of her book, but I think that you've laid out a number of steps of looking at what other professions have done and figuring out which really works in terms of our context. And I think this power to the profession initiative that's going on at the NAEYC, the National Association for Education of Young Children, is a powerful part of that process. And I think it's just beginning. I don't think there's a whole lot of knowledge about this initiative as of yet, but I'm assuming that we'll be hearing much more from NAEYC about it in the future.
So I would, building from that, to be a recognized profession, in fact, state licensure is required, because one of the things that happens, and now licensure being that the state, and there's actually, their bodies, I should say groups, entities, within each state that are given or assigned responsibilities and the obligations that go with them around licensure boards. So it's not tied to a particular agency like a Department of Ed or a Department of Health and Human Services. There's actually a regulatory entity, and it includes members of the profession as well as other appointees that are about protecting the public. Because ultimately what state licensure is about is saying, yes, based upon what is demanded by your profession, we can feel assured that you meet the basic or minimal requirements to do no harm in your role, and therefore you have been licensed to practice in our state.
And I'm going to just say again, it's really important to distinguish this type of licensure from what we think about as licensed teachers who are licensed by State Board of Education organizations to function in the public school settings, correct?
Correct. Yes.
I think that's just something that I don't think a lot of people have thought about. Where would such a licensure body exist? Who would make up that body? What's the structure, the governance, the funding?
Well, the profession, the state, the various professions have model legislation and look to. So back to your comment about the opportunity to learn from other professions, because one of the things I've had the chance to learn, and I've now studied, maybe I should have a count at some point, but a number of other and varied recognized professional fields of practice. And there are the things that are their commonalities, which are the ones I was naming around what defines or characterizes a profession. But there's also, which I think is important for us as we move forward, there's variability in how some of those points or elements are actualized that have to do with the history of the field, the nature of their practice, in the context of the time when their interests emerged, and then the length of time that it may have taken for them. And for all of them, it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight, that it takes for them ultimately to become a recognized profession. So it's not just because architects decide to call themselves professionals. You have to be recognized as such, and it's the state licensure that recognizes you and then recognizes you as a professional field of practice And typically, I mean, there is imperfection in all of this, but typically relies heavily upon the profession's determination of the competencies in the accreditation of its preparation programs as requirements for sitting for licensure. That's what we about learning from other professions, that there are variations because of the context of their work that leads to some individuality in how the profession is structured.
I mean, yes, and I think that there's specialized knowledge and skills. So working with infants or toddlers or preschool or school age are specific skills and knowledge base that could be recognized in addition to the basic knowledge of child development and basic pedagogy for working with young children, birth through age 8. So like the idea is that there's additional competencies essentially when you're focusing in a particular area.
And so then that raises two other points. So one that comes down to it's not only the specialty against the scope of practice. So then you can have like early childhood intervention, early childhood special ed as other examples. And you could also say, is it primarily by the age of the child? The opportunity, again, that we have is to really be creative and to think about, we do tend to say infants, sometimes separating out toddlers, sometimes not. Preschool, pre-K, most people still want to hold on to kindergarten. I'm not sure, if we still have that opportunity or not. But again, I think there are a couple of different ways of thinking about what those specialties would be. Part of what I think matters in this conversation, and you've really spoken to this a couple of times, is that there really is a knowledge base to understand to help inform our movement going forward.
Thanks to Stacie for joining us, and thanks to you for watching. What do you want to hear about in the next episode? Tell us in the comment section below. Until next time.